Patrick and I had a very interesting conversation at the spring event in Armagh back in April, where Patrick was saying that AE Society has been doing some great work of exegesis, of surfacing AE's ideas, his thoughts, and explaining them, putting them in context. And that is true, and that, of course, was a very essential first step to the work of the society in reviving and bringing AE's work back to life. But for such an experiential figure as AE, this is always going to be moving towards a more experiential approach to him. So I was thrilled because I thought this was exactly the next step. And so when Patrick suggested that I might like to talk about Ella Young for this talk, I thought, well, these two approaches belong together utterly, because both AE and Ella Young, for their entire lives, were clairvoyants, seers. They saw spiritual beings, and they developed their gifts with, seriousness and dedication throughout their lives. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to talk about vision in theoretically, but also practically, and moving towards experientially. So I wanted to say that when we're talking about seership, I'm not just talking about it as a natural gift that someone like AE or lots of people throughout human history have had. I'm talking about it as a spiritual path, committed path, a way of life, a way of authentic engagement that makes human life and life on the planet more meaningful, truer, and genuinely magical. But I also want to emphasize I'm not just going to be talking about inner imaginings that some of us may or may not have, pictorial imagery in our minds. I mean, that is, of course, part of our psyche, our magical part of our inner realm. But for AE himself and for Ella, this was a way of engaging with the gods, if you like, with the hidden forces and realities behind life. It was very practical, and it underpinned their very practical lives and careers. They both had extremely busy, engaged, activist life, and that's the sense in which I want to present vision to you as the underpinning of spiritual and magical life. Next slide. Thank you. So I'm mostly going to be talking about Ella Young this afternoon, though I'm going to introduce my talk about Ella with some musings about vision, and then we're going to conclude with an experience. So bookending an actual talk about Ella and her life. But I want to give some pointers as part of that to the path of vision that AE and Ella Young both followed, and lots of people before and since then, and that you and I could and can, and some of us I'm sure do. So before moving on to the Ella section, I just wanted to throw out some ideas to create a kind of loose framework. I'll be using some repetition deliberately, and if it seems a bit abstract, bear with me, it'll all come together beautifully as the talk progresses. So there is a plan. So just to give some examples of the kind of things that Seer, someone who engages with the inner life vision, might experience. But imagine you might be in a forest walking in the hush of a spring morning, and suddenly you become aware of a nature spirit. This being is clearly non-physical, and you're seeing it at least partly with your mind's eye. But you feel compelled to describe it to yourself in such terms as a gnome or a fairy or a pixie. And these words sound silly, and they're human words, and yet there are no other relevant words for this kind of experience. You have a clear sense of this being's mental state, its work, its relationship with nature and other such beings. Such a thing might happen, does happen. Or again, you might be on a mountain, a sacred mountain. Suddenly you might become aware of a being or a force so powerful that it almost blinds your inner eye. Seems more powerful, almost more awesome than the nature being you met before. It might give you very direct advice about your life and future. Or again, One night you might dream a dream, a vivid lucid dream about a place or a society that you've never seen. The inner integrity of the vision, its specificity, is such that it has the ring of truth. It feels like a presentation of a real place, either a past place or another world. And that, of course, is a kind of vision that A.E. had many times in his life and was very important to his path and development. So examples of the kind of things that, especially people who have a natural propensity to seership, these things might happen to them. And then their question becomes, what does it mean? Is it real? How do I interact with it? And if you're like A.E. at that point, you will start thinking, studying, comparing your experiences, and it will become the beginning of a journey. But such experiences in themselves, I think, are much more common than people, society has allowed itself to admit. People, I think, have visions of various forms often, and it's our failure to pay attention to them and value them that means the subject is underrated and in some realms still taboo, but that is changing. So next slide, please. So just a kind of whistle-stop, tour through some traditions of seership. I mean, perhaps the oldest and the first, and maybe the universal, is traditional folk seership. And this is, the universal experience of peoples, Aboriginal, native peoples throughout history, of natural psychics in our time, of being aware of nature's spirits, of having second sight, various forms of clairvoyance, to use a not very beautiful word, and in some ways this is the underpinning of our human visionary ability, that this has been a part of the human experience for millennia, and I would say always will. I almost see it as being the foundation of everything. The heights of A.E.'s metaphysics has its roots in the depths of this animist feeling that everything is alive and everything can be met intuitively if we reach out to it and we allow it to connect with us. So never forget our folk heritage, but also mysticism. And I've listed some Christian mystics, but the mystics of all the great religions, really. There has always been a Gnostic aspect to this mysticism. So I mentioned Jakob Boehme, the great German mystic, Emanuel Swedenborg, the Swedes, William Blake, great hero to W.B. Yeats and A.E. himself. Now, they all had vivid vision lives, but that contained very specific teachings about the cosmos, humanity, the meaning of life, where we're all going. And that has been very much a neglected part of religion. I mean, it's a funny thing that religion has generally been founded by mystics and visionaries, and then a couple of generations later, if you'll excuse me for saying, the priest class take over and ban vision, and are not happy about new visionaries appearing in religions founded by visionaries. But that's society for you. Now, vision made a big comeback in the 19th century thanks to the Romantic movement. So the primacy of imagination, of emotion, of intense experience in painting, in literature, in poetry, and elsewhere, brought imagination back to its rightful place as the expression of artistic inspiration, which is really a bardic gift as it was presenting itself to the Romantics. So this is a revival of the understanding of the seer or bard as a cultural leader. And of course, A.E. himself, coming in the late Romantic period, he can be seen in some respects as a romantic, especially if you look at his paintings as well, and then moving in towards the symbolist work. This is all connected with vision. It's a cultural expression. And this gradually seeps back into the kind of the mainstream scientific consensus, where vision had been very unfashionable in the age of science and so-called enlightenment, and it comes back into culture very much through psychoanalysis, through Freud, reminding us all that dreams come from this subconscious part of us and often have vital teachings about who we are and what we need to wake up to, that our conscious minds are unable to hear. And in Jung, Freud's successor, or let's say one of Freud's students, this really almost approaches the traditional occult view that visions and dreams are inner guidance from if you like, our true self or a higher self, the self that we are growing into. So we're coming very back to the traditional spiritual view of vision there, and happening at really the same period, and kind of, to me, the most important thing, you have the emergence out of obscurity of the great initiation traditions, by which I mean there have always been schools where the arts of vision, intuition, inspiration, seership, whatever you want to call it, have been taught methodically as a science that was known to a small number of people who taught it to other people they thought were capable of learning it and passing it on. And so you have theosophy, where Madame Blavatsky was bringing forward some of those Eastern teachings. You have Rudolf Steiner doing the same with the more Central European Western teachings, or the Golden Dawn, in which Yeats, of course, was taught. So there you see that by the beginning of the 20th century, in the time in which A and Ella Young are working, vision has come back to its rightful place at the center of culture. So next slide, please. I won't say much about this. So some people here may be wondering, or may not be quite sure about vision, whether to believe it, frankly, and so I suppose there's a sliding scale from people who just, I saw a nature spirit, so it was clearly there, that's the end of the story, pure belief, and sometimes a little bit literal. And the other extreme would be people who think it's all nonsense, or it's just in my head, just imagination. I don't want to rubbish that view, because I think having a critical view to vision and what we see in our mind's eye is really important, actually. But I'd like to advocate to all of us here, what I think is the practical and useful relationship to vision is that some of these images, this imagery, is so inspiring, helpful, and personally meaningful. And I always find that with A.E.'s paintings, even if I don't quite understand what he's showing, I find it so inspiring. So this sense of gnosis, of personal gnosis, that to be attentive to the beautiful world of imagistic teaching, without necessarily worrying too much about whether it's true or false in a given context, is useful. Now, I've said those are three attitudes, but there aren't really any ultimate divisions between them, as I hope will become clear. So next slide, please. So when I was thinking about this, just in terms of the framework I said I'd be throwing at you to give some context, people who are interested in visions, whether their own or other people's, you have to have a few of them first, and then, like A, you start trying to think, well, how can I taxonomize them? And of course, the candle of vision, in many ways, is A's, rather philosophical and sometimes slightly unrevealing discussion of what visions meant to him and what he learnt about them. Beautiful book, not always very explicit, because you get the feeling he wasn't sure how much he could say to a wider audience that might not have had anything like the kind of experiences that he'd had. So it sometimes, to me, seems a bit cryptic, although I think it's also wonderful. But I thought, can I be a little bit more analytical, I suppose, about this subject? So I'm just going to throw out a couple of sets of divisions, three kinds of seer. So one is the natural, untrained, the natural psychic, if you like, would be one way of describing it. And another one would be the systematic and trained, someone who'd been through the schools I was mentioning, like Yeats. But I think there's a third kind as well, which is most unusual and most interesting, the idiosyncratic. Now, to me, A.E. is a one-off, a rare genius. He just had a spiritual disposition and a set of talents that were so unusual that I think it was probably impossible to replicate. And these people are kind of the mystics and geniuses, don't really fit into other categories. And I like to recognize A in that way, that he's an inspiring figure, but it would be hard to follow him. In fact, I don't think you could. You could just benefit from him. And within that, I thought, well, different kinds of vision, objective vision. Well, what do I mean by that? I mean, there are presences in nature. There is a world of ideas that is spiritually real, that belief. So that's one orientation to vision. And of course, Ellie Young's life is filled with that belief in the reality, the inner reality of the beings and powers that she met. And another one I would call cognitive, by which I mean there are visions where what is shown is, as it were, a massive rush of understanding that might take 12 books to encompass, and it would be seen in a kind of set of related symbolic images that is very hard to describe. Often, the biblical revelation has that sense of the prophet has seen something which is actually like an extensive cosmic teaching in an image. And I think A.E. had these experiences frequently, a kind of gnosis, vision as gnosis. And another kind of image is, or vision image, is the magical approach. So this is very much Yeats's approach, that he's fascinated by the idea that symbols are forces in the world's soul, the anima mundi, and that what gave his poetry its charge was that he was giving physical expression through his poetry to these forces, and that there is a power, transformative power in that. Okay, so what am I trying to get across to everyone through this theoretical section? The main point I'm trying to make is approach vision in any way that you find personally interesting and exciting, because the whole field is so broad and everything it crosses. There is no wrong way of entering this. And in fact, all perspectives meet, and A shows how all perspectives meet. So I would encourage anyone, whether you think clairvoyance is real, whether you think A's visions of the Tuha were objective, that doesn't matter. Follow your path of engagement and interest in. Thank you. Next slide, please. So, okay, so I've given you some scattered theoretical ideas which will kind of fall into place. But what I wanted to start with is an experience. Well, the experiential aspect of the Dublin Hermetic Society, the work that A.E. was doing with the students, was kind of first and foremost, especially for A.E., because yes, they were studying theosophy, they're reading Blavatsky, studying the Upanishads, but they were doing meditation, and A.E. and his inner circle were doing quite intense meditation, and they would go on spiritual walking tours, particularly in the Dublin mountains. So in many ways, A.E. was running a spiritual school. I think I do see it in these terms. Ella was one of his probably leading students in the school. And I think actually I'm just going to read an excerpt from Flowering Dusk because it feels appropriate at this moment. This is Ella's first introduction to A.E. actually at the Hermetic Society. I had been at theosophical meetings that were livelier than this one, meetings where you didn't have to listen to gospelers. This was a situation where a Christian had started heckling the theosophists and telling them they were going to hell for studying this stuff. But apparently he kept coming back to the meetings, so he was just a regular fixture. But Ella wasn't overly impressed by this. So, and I was just resolving that this first visit to the theosophical rooms would be my last, when someone rose at the back of the hall and began to speak. It was a wonderful voice, unlike any other I had ever heard. I craned round to see who possessed it. In the dim light at the end of the hall, I could see a tall, slender, bearded man. He leaned slightly forward as he spoke. He spoke eagerly, but his talk had nothing to do with anything that had been said earlier in the evening. I don't really know what he said. I could only think that here was the most bewildering person I had ever encountered. He did not seem to be human, but rather the vehicle through which some being, rainbow-hued and unearthly, manifested itself. When he ceased speaking, I sat for a while in wonderment, till Helen said, "We had better be getting home." So that was Ella's first impression of A.E. So really the best thing in terms of an experiential introduction to vision in A.E.'s manner would be if we had AE here, we could go for a walking tour with him in the Dublin Mountains. Or I would say to study with AE and Ella, because they had very different but complementary approaches. And if you work with their two approaches, you have a wonderful introduction to land spirituality. But since we don't have AE with us except in spirit, I'm going to try and evoke the manner of that in the talk. So, right, last slide, please. Sorry, of the first part of this. So, since AE's time, there's been quite a revival of desire to connect with the spirit in nature, a hankering for an earth-based spirituality, a remembrance of that connection. And there was a great vogue of books about developing psychic faculties, advice on how to meet nature spirits. There are workshops you can go and do these things. And this is all very good. But I think we still have so much to learn from AE and Ella's approach, the approach of the Hermetic Society, which is both more accessible to, I think, to the general people, but it also goes deeper. It's grounded in deep study of the ancient wisdom and systematic training. As we'll see later, Ella was running a spiritual school along very particular lines, as did AE. And I would say motive is the key. This isn't just curiosity. Ooh, I wonder if I can discover hidden secrets about nature and have weird visions. No, their work throughout was grounded in commitment to the land, nature, the people, their community, their political engagement, and really, yeah, their love for the life that they were living. And I want to say that without a kind of ethos of motive and commitment, the New Age movement, the way it approaches these things, can become quite ungrounded, and I would say even unreal. So the spiritual bypassing, this whole tendency to look for visions that will soothe and please you or aggrandize you rather than do the world any good. And they're often sci-fi escapism. People, if you go to some of these workshops, you'll be told that the Earth is ascending to the fifth dimension, and there are 25 planes of existence, and so on and so forth. No, I would say many of us would do a lot better to read Flowering Dusk, study folklore, esoteric tradition, and get out into nature and walk, open your senses. And Ella did this, and we're just about to talk about Ella now, but I wanted to say it hasn't been appreciated yet that Ella did something remarkable, which is that she studied in AE school, in the inner school, but she also had access to Yeats's Celtic Mysteries order and the work done. And she, in fact, took both of those impulses forward and created a quite unique synthesis. And the third element in that, which again hasn't really been appreciated, is that we often talk about the network of men. Ella was part of a quite remarkable network of women who had their own spiritual current that hasn't always been seen as distinct as it was. She was very close to Maud Gonne. Both of them were extremely psychic, and they were part of a group of women who were very sensitive to the spirit of the times and had prophetic abilities, as you'll see in Flowering Dusk, and were politically engaged on the basis very much of their inner life. And that could be a whole talk, the women's circle. So I'll just, without further ado, having set the scene, we'll move on to Ella. Next slide, please. So, Flowering Dusk, Holy Thorn Press, delighted to publish the first modern edition of Ella Young's memoir and autobiography since it was published for the first and only time previously during World War II. So, yeah, next slide, please. Now, I should say, if you want to follow up more information about Ella, there's an excellent resource, ellayoung.org, and this book, Ella Young Remembered, with interviews by James D. Kane, very helpful for a living sense of Ella. Linda Rosewood, who I think couldn't be here today, has done phenomenal work. She brought the Flowering Dust Project to Holy Thorn Press. She is a fount of information about all things Ella and California. And I just want to pay tribute really to the website and to Linda's work. Next slide, please. So Ella. I'm now going to read out essentially most of the talk that Sally gave at the Ella Young event in London last month. So thank you and greetings from Sally, who couldn't be here because she's at a different conference today. But her talk was so good that I literally felt there's nothing better I could do than to deliver it on her behalf. So Ella Young was born in 1867 in County Antrim. She grew up mainly in Limerick and later Dublin, where her father was a Presbyterian minister. She had very, very vivid memories of her childhood and her early vision experiences. She graduated as a Bachelor of Arts from the Royal University of Dublin in 1896, and she also did an MA at Trinity. She was attending the Theosophical Society in Dublin, where she met AE, and she became an active member, and most likely of the Dublin Hermetic Society, which met at the Household in 3 Upper Ely Place. Thanks to AE's patronage, Ella's poems began to be published in the newspaper The Irish Homestead, which he edited for a number of years. She also started to give public talks on Irish mythology to a wide audience. Around the turn of the century, Ella became more and more involved with the nationalistic movement in Ireland through the early 1900s and beyond. Unlike the pacifist beliefs of her friend and mentor AE, Ella supported armed revolution. She became acquainted with Padraig Pearse and the other leaders of the independence movement. She also travelled in Ireland as detailed in Flowering Dusk. She went to the west of Ireland and fell in love with the austere beauty of the land. She visited ancient sites like the Cave of the Red Steeds. She went to Mayo, Clare, Kerry, all the places where the old Irish customs still prevailed and where she could listen to shanachis and musicians by the fireside in simple little farmhouses. She went to Slieve Gullion in County Down, an ancient site with cairns and other stone monuments on the top of the mountain. Slieve Gullion has associations with the Cailleach, the old woman goddess, who has several sites on the mountainside named after her, including a stone chair which had a Lunasa tradition associated with it. It was on this mountain where the great Irish hero of the Ulster sagas left behind his boyhood name Setanta and became the legendary Cuchulainn. She met Maud Gonne and they became very close. Ella was one of the founder members of Maud's radical nationalist women's association, Inina Nahéireann, in 1900. Its stated aims were to work for the complete independence of Ireland and the promotion of Irish culture and the Irish language. She was very supportive to Maud Gonne throughout her divorce, etc. She even went to stay in France with Maud, and here we read of her visit to the head of the Golden Dawn, MacGregor Mathers, and also to Rodin's studio. Ella wrote nothing about her more esoteric activities, but according to Maud, Ella formed a group of her own in 1900, breaking away from the Eastern mysticism of AE and the Theosophical tradition. This became the earliest iteration of Ella's Fellowship of the Four Jewels, a magical order that she founded and which she took to America in a different form. Now, Ella and Maud corresponded almost right up until Ella's death in the 1950s. Next slide, please. Yeah, okay. So Maud Gonne illustrated 3 of Ella's books, Coming of Lugh, Celtic Wonder Tales, and The Rose of Heaven. That's from The Coming of Lugh. And we'll have the next slide when you're ready, please. Yeah. Celtic Wonder Tales. And the next one again, those are from The Rose of Heaven. So The Coming of Lugh is really a booklet telling the story of how Lugh of the Tuatha Dé Danann was taken as a child to live with Manannán mac Lir, the sea god, but returns in time to help the Tuatha defeat the Fomorians, and was charmingly illustrated by Maud. In 1910, Ella had published her first proper full-length book, Celtic Wonder Tales, her imaginative retelling of stories like The Children of Lir, of Aideen, The Golden Fly, of Nuada, and The Silver Spear. Next slide, please. Yeah. It was profusely illustrated by Maud Gonne, who not only supplied the coloured illustrations, but also the black and white section headings and ending, and also decorated capitals. So I do have some postcards with one of those images here for any who'd like one. Maud Gonne's artwork. So one item which recently came to light was an embroidered cloth made by Maud Gonne, which echoes the design in Celtic Wonder Tales. Next slide, please. Here we can see the Cleave Solis, the Spear of Lugh, Dagda's cauldron, but where is the stone? Well, this particular image, next slide, illustrates a story called the Eric Feen of Lugh, where the stone is described as a shining jewel rather than the more prosaic stone of W.B. Yeats's Celtic Order. It's Sally's belief that this banner was made by Maud Gonne for the Fellowship of the Four Jewels, and I think she's correct. In 1911, another census was taken and Ella is listed again. But what a difference 10 years makes. Next slide, please. She's living or perhaps staying with a young English writer, Olive Fox, who is listed as the head of the household. And where religion is listed on the form, they both put down pagan. Perhaps the only two self-professed pagans in Ireland at the time. I think at this point in her life, Ella had moved out of home and was living with Olivia Fox. The house in which they were living was haunted, and when Maud came to stay, she was quite disturbed by it, and there's a fascinating account of that in Flowering Dusk. As we know, on April the 24th, 1916, a coalition of the Irish Republican Brotherhood, the Irish Citizens' Army, and the Irish Volunteers began an armed insurgency against British colonial rule in Ireland. Ella didn't play an active part in the rising, but she describes her experiences in Easter week in Flowering Dusk. Next slide, please. And it needs to be said that out of the 12 women who were on the founding committee of Inina na hÉireann, 4 of them went on to marry leaders of the revolution, 3 of whom received the death penalty in the aftermath. And one of the founders actually led a squadron of insurgents herself at Stephen's Green. That was, of course, Constance Markiewicz. These women were absolutely central to the planning and execution of the rising. Ella recognized the rising itself was a kind of magical sacrifice for the foundation of a free Ireland. Her disappointment at the later, as she saw it, betrayal of that sacrifice, which led to the treaty in 1921 and the ensuing civil war, was profound, and I think led directly to her decision a few years later to leave Ireland forever. The treaty and the subsequent forgetting of the rising galvanized Ella to campaign for some kind of public acknowledgement of the people who had been involved. She suggested to friends that a memorial book based on the beautiful illuminated manuscripts made in Irish monasteries in medieval times should be made. This became the Leabhar na hÉireann, illuminated by Arto Monaghan. We'll have a slide, please. So this is one image from Arto Monaghan's work. And the next one, which is the particular favourite, I've showed this before. This is the Ulster page from the Book of the Rising. You can see the red hand in the top right, and you can see Ard Machar in the steps up in the middle. It's full of symbolism, some of it esoteric symbolism as well. So it's a wonderful book, and I should say Holy Thorn Press are hoping we can publish some kind of facsimile of this if we can. It will be very expensive, but it needs to see the light of day. So 1925 was a momentous year for Ella. Her father and her beloved brother died. It was also the year that she left Ireland forever, travelling to the United States on a ship appropriately named the America, entering through Ellis Island, where the passenger manifest describes her as a lecturer. After a certain amount of travel through New York State and beyond, Ella went to California to stay with old friends from the AE circle, John and Agnes Varian. They lived in a theosophical community called the Temple of the People, founded by William Dower and Francia Ledoux, who'd been members of the esoteric section of the Theosophical Society. And originally founded in New York, they moved across the other side of the states to Halcyon, California in 1903. Next slide, please. It was and still is a thriving, oh, sorry, I forgot this slide. I'll pause what I was saying and I'll talk to this slide, thanks. So Ella's Flowering Dusk is divided into 2 halves, quite distinct halves, Ireland and America. And there's a kind of poignant note to her, oh, excuse me, that's my phone, it's terrible. there are fascinating accounts of vision experiences that Ella and her female circle were having in the early part of the 20th century, where it's becoming clear to them that there is a change in the airs, if you like. There's been a change in the times, and something that was beautiful in Ireland and everything they'd known was going. And they felt this new, harder spirit coming into the world. The different psychic people in different parts of the world all had this independently around 1903 and 1904. And their perception was that in many ways, America was going to be where the new power was. And in some ways, Ella was nostalgic for everything that had been wished for Ireland. But in other respects, she had a huge love and respect for America. And she threw her weight in to some degree with the tawny lioness, as she often describes this sort of, sometimes indolent but powerful force of the being of America. Thanks. Next slide. So yeah, this is one of the main buildings from the Temple of the People settlement in Halcyon, California. So soon after arriving at Halcyon, Ella revived her Irish ritual order, the Fellowship of the Four Jewels, and its membership list from the early days has survived, and thanks to Linda Rosewood was found in an archive. We can see her friends John and Agnes Varian and other Halcyon residents on the list. Okay. The Varians had 3 sons who befriended a strange musical genius called Henry Cowell. Next slide, please. No, we'll move on, please. Skip on, yeah. Skip, yeah. Henry Cowell. And under the influence of the Varians and Ella Young, Henry Cowell composed the music for a musical play or opera called The Building of Banba, based on Irish mythological themes. The Tides of Manannán was the prelude to the play, and it's possibly his best known piece. It's a kind of almost like a legendary piece of American modernist piano music, and very influential on later 20th century classical music. Henry Cowell also wrote pieces with titles like The Voice of Lear, The Banshee, The Trumpet of Aengus Og, and The Harp of Life, some of which may have also been incidental music for The Building of Banba. A name which isn't on the list, probably because he joined a bit later, is another American luminary whose work needs little introduction. Ansel Adams, the great American landscape photographer and conservationist, was also a member of the Fellowship. Next slide, please. Yeah, we'll skip on, thanks. Yeah, and again, okay, yeah, well, that's Gavin Arthur, but we'll leave Gavin up there. In an interview that Ansel gave to James Cain in 1966, he described Ella thus: "The little people were tangible, and she saw them. They were quite appropriate. They were dressed in fog coats because we were in the fog belt. They were grey and diaphanous and opalescent." Cain asked Ansel about the group that he was in with Ella and about the Fianna of Lugh, where the stone is described as a shining jewel rather than the more prosaic stone of Yeats's order. When Ansel Adams was being interviewed about the group, he got very uncharacteristically vague. He said the mantra that Ella Young had given him was a secret. You could never tell anybody about it at the time. So I had to keep that promise. I still feel a little awed by it. This was a serious business. The Fellowship, later named the Fellowship of Shasta by Ella, continued to meet by the 4 great feasts until the 1970s. Linda Rosewood was able to track down some of the documents of the Fellowship which relate to the feasts, and it's clear from reading the material that the group took the whole work seriously. It wasn't just a case of turning up on the night with a robe and a bottle of wine, ready to do some pagan ritual. Preparations, for example, for Samhain, next slide please, started 7 days beforehand with spiritual exercises and meditations and so on. So the first 3 days were called the Nuts of Knowledge, after the hazel trees, which drop their nuts into the waters at the Well of Conla. These were then eaten by the salmon of knowledge. On the first day, the person should endeavor to realize by meditation the spiritual significance of the past of your life. The 4th or middle day of the 7 was called the Feast of Age. Rid the mind of all material objects, let the outer world drop away. Think of yourself as spirit only, entering into the world of spirits and divine presence. The final 3 days were called the Golden Apples, the aim being to endeavour to absorb and assimilate the wisdom, strength, and beauty gained during the feast, and to shape them in yourself to form that can meet the conditions of the outer material world. So there again, this is using the inner work to prepare for the next phase of activity inspired by the vision of the nuts of knowledge. The Feast of Lughnasadh took 9 days of preparatory meditation with different reflections on fire. There was an invocation to be said to Lu. I call up thee, O living God, radiant with the illuminating fire, O unseen parent of the sun. Pour forth thy light-giving power and energy to thy divine spark. Enter into this flame and let it be agitated by the breath of thy spirit. Manifest thy power and open for us the temple of Almighty God, which is within this fire. Manifest thy light for our regeneration, and let breadth, height, fullness, the crown of solar radiance appear, and may the God within ever shine forth. As I said before, the fellowship continued after Ella died, and she left the responsibility for it to Gavin Arthur, who I showed before, her great friend. He was grandson of Chester Arthur, the 21st President of the United States, who had travelled to Ireland in the 1920s to discover his Irish roots, and was probably instrumental in bringing Ella to America. He was one of the Junites, a community of artists, freethinkers, weirdos, as Sally said, and proto-hippies, who lived literally on the beach in the dunes at Oceano, California. Professional astrologer and sexologist, Arthur was a fascinating figure who had friends in every level of society despite his privileged upbringing. He was also one of the people involved in a plot hatched by Ella Young, Maud Gonne and W.B. Yeats to steal the Stone of Destiny from Westminster Abbey in London. Didn't happen, sadly. That would have been quite something. In his interview with James Cain, Arthur described how they celebrated the 4 feasts where Ella came for years to celebrate with the fellowship. He also said, she left me in charge of the fellowship of the 4 Jewels, which now became the fellowship of Shasta. And to this day, we celebrate up in the canyon near St. Helena, between St. Helena and Calistoga, on the estate of her great friends Jack Lyman and his wife Helen Hoyt. We celebrate still where her ashes are scattered under the redwood trees. Next slide, please. This interview was from 1966, so the fellowship was going then, and we believe for some years after. Right up to the end of her life, Ella continued to write. She had some notable successes in America with her books of Irish stories for children, like The Tangle-Coated Horse and The Unicorn of the Silver Shoes. The Unicorn with Silver Shoes. She continued writing collections of poetry, her last published work being Smoke of Myrrh and Other Poems, which came out in 1950, just 6 years before she died. She also lectured on Irish mythology and history at the University of California in Berkeley, where she held a chair for a decade. Her other passion, of course, was environmental conservation, particularly of the redwood trees and forests of California. And it was in a grove of redwoods where her ashes were scattered after her death in 1956. So that's Ella, a mighty figure, really. I said this talk would be in 3 parts, with an introduction with some theoretical ideas on vision, a talk about Ella, and now I'd like to move towards an experience. So next slide, please. Now, as I said near the beginning, the best thing we could do would, and which AE did with his group, would be to go on a vision quest at sacred sites, for example, in the Dublin Mountains, ideally with AE himself. But I think we're near enough to the Dublin Mountains that we're in their aura, and I think we can do some work here indoors. And really, the inner realms aren't ultimately spatial. They can be accessed anywhere. And when I say corroborated, I mean, if you work with some friends and do some exercises remotely working with vision and imagination of places you haven't been, and then go to those places, I think you'll be surprised at how revelatory experience not had physically in a place can be. Just a suggestion. And there are techniques that one can use when one's working not in the landscape but indoors. Next slide, please. So there are various ways of approaching the realms of vision, inner and outer realms. In fact, there's no real method, although there are guidelines and things that people have felt useful over the millennia, and I'm just going to mention a couple of them. And I think the first one is really just to become attentive to our inner life and our stream of consciousness. There's a strong pressure in life nowadays to be unaware of what is going on inside us, unless we need to think about something actively, or unless we have a strong emotional pressure. For many of us, the constant inner stream of life, conscious and subconscious, is passing by. And my advice to anyone that hasn't done this is take the time to pay attention to your inner stream of consciousness. And, some of it will be what it is. And every now and then you'll see something more than you might have expected coming into that. So this is really at the beginning of meditation, becoming observant to your own inner stream of consciousness. And I'd like to make a recommendation as well for people that haven't done this before, don't think they're psychic, whatever. Remember, cast your mind back to a time when you were in nature and you felt some kind of enchantment, some kind of hush of reverence and sense that something was transpiring that you couldn't see and you couldn't put your finger on. And in your room, in meditation, return to it, dwell on it, and see if you realize that you were actually aware of more at the time than you were aware of being aware of, if you know what I mean. It's like looking back on things sometimes, you realize that you sensed more, perhaps through the corner of your eye, than you had acknowledged to yourself at the time. So this is something we can do. We can go into nature, immerse ourselves in it, come back and dwell on what spoke to us inwardly, and more reveals itself. Now, of course, another way, the way AE followed, among others, is to specifically develop the inner senses, the eyes of the soul, the chakras, as they call them in the Indian tradition. This is probably the hardest. It's not easy for everyone. It's always been regarded as for the few, because if people try to do this without knowing exactly what they're doing, you can have strange side effects, sometimes not very comfortable side effects. But in the schools of East and West, it's always been taught, and this is for people who want corroboration that there are mysteries out there we can't see with our physical eyes, and that there are eyes of the soul, and there are ways of developing them. That path is always there if you can find a decent teacher. And beyond that rather arcane and esoteric thing, there are ways of interacting with our imagination, nothing weird and occult, just the gift of creative imagination we all have. And this has become part of psychology in the 20th century. Guided meditations, visualizations, all of these things that only used to be practiced in small circles. They're quite normal, and people do. There are mindfulness courses. There are visualization courses in every adult education college, probably, really. And the focused use of these things can be quite, again, revelatory for people who haven't yet done it. So, next slide. Thank you. I was thinking, since we're not out in the Dublin Mountains doing this in a group, which I hope we will be in the future, by the way, sometime, just to give some kind of summaries of some things I've found useful, and I've found other people to find useful. Study one of the great traditions in detail. So I'm talking about the great Eastern traditions, if that is meaningful to you, or say the Western traditions of Rosicrucianism, Kabbalah, Sufism, if you're Muslim. The great traditions exist in all religions and in non-religions. Shamanism of ancient, all of these traditions have a coherent inner cosmology, a map of where you're trying to go, and a method to get there. And once you've encountered a system that makes sense to you and you find engaging, you're going to want to take a couple of years to digest it. Realistically, you're going to read it, think about it, live with it, because for people who follow the path of vision, and even like AE, who have extraordinary, technicolor imaginations, what unlocks that is not so much, in my opinion, weird techniques. It's that our soul becomes completely transformed over the years when we learn a new way of looking at things. And gradually, organically, you start to see, without the need for any weird devices or methods, see life differently and more richly. So you found a tradition, you're mulling it and digesting it, and it's changing the way you live your life, like it did for AE and for Ella Young. And at that point, obviously, meditation in nature is going to be really helpful to you to do what AE encourages us to do all the time in his poetry and his writings, which is to leave our day-to-day mundane concerns, our boring job. AE found his job in Dublin in the 1890s terribly boring, really, but it spurred his visionary life to find that freedom to go into nature and turn on your inner senses. Allow yourself to be attentive to things we don't normally attend to when we're, around the coffee machine in the office. Have the experience, gather it all up, bring it home, and live with it. Now, it's incredibly simple. I'm just encouraging everyone and saying to, even in our sophisticated 21st century, that some of the most intelligent people in history have done all this. And we can do it with no qualms. It's a respectable path. It's naive. It's also very, very sophisticated as well. But I will just say one thing, and it probably doesn't need saying in Ireland, although I should say it, which is if you are going to fairy sites or particular sacred sites, please be aware of the traditional folklore and etiquette around them, because blundering into certain sites without due respect and knowledge can be a recipe for trouble. And I probably don't need to say any more about that. Some people may know firsthand what I'm talking about. All I can say is it's true. And I'd be irresponsible if I encouraged everyone to get out into nature and have experiences without saying that. Next slide, please. So yeah, I would say again, when you get your copy of Flowering Dusk, becoming a friend of nature. It's so for Ella, who was a very intelligent and very spiritual woman. It was very simple. She loved nature. She loved life. It comes across in every page. She loved animals, and that increasing desire to connect with her world, particularly with her island, unfolded more and more into deeper and deeper vision, or not vision. One incident she describes in Flowering Dusk is that she somehow acquired a kind of familiar spirit, really, or well, whether she wanted or not, a being that she called Gilpin. She knew that some kind of being was living in her space and was playing tricks and moving things and chucking things around. She'd never seen it. And then a friend of hers, one of the psychic women friends in her circle, came in and said, "Oh, I see you've got a mountain elf in the room." And so, "Oh, really? I've never seen it. What do they look like?" And she said, "Well, they look the way they always look." But Ella's incredibly elemental nature obviously will draw beings like that towards her. And she describes other accounts in Flowering Dusk of going on retreats in secluded parts of nature and hearing this magical music. And she, becoming stiller and stiller, she became more and more attentive to the music in the landscape, which she could actually hear and even write down. So, very simple and infused with a poetic sensibility. It helps to have a sense that machinery and pragmatism is not all there is to life. I'm not going to speak about this now, but I think something special was going on with this group of people, led by AE, with Yeats's input, and a whole circle of geniuses, really, which I can only really call the rebirth of the Hibernian mysteries. And what do I mean by this? I mean, there's an ancient legend in different parts of Europe that there were great mystery schools of education in the tradition, like I mentioned, everywhere from Eleusis to Samothrace to India, Egypt, and that one of the great ones was in Ireland. And it was said that even the spiritual seekers who'd studied in different schools and learned what they could learn in Egypt or in Asia Minor would travel to Ireland for a culminating initiation. As an interesting legend that somehow resurfaced or became very meaningful, not just in Ireland, but to different spiritual seekers in Europe at the beginning of the 20th century. And my observation is that this was in fact happening, and that these group of people were sometimes quite consciously bringing back the Druid mysteries that are older than the Druid mysteries of Ireland in their time. And that's why they had these extraordinary gifts, because they had an extraordinary work to do. But that's a whole topic, and in some ways that's something that is subject for a future talk and a future book, in fact. Next. So that's all I wanted to say, to give a broad view of how a combination of theory and getting into nature leads to the path of friendship with nature and spiritual engagement. And so I thought, with your permission, if we have time, I'd like to do a short meditation. Do we have time? Yeah, okay. So I've got a little image from Fornox. Let's do a little meditation. So I'm sure some of you are very familiar with the process of meditation and visualization. Let's begin by preparing for meditation in a normal way. So feel your body, relax. If you feel any muscular tension in your legs or anywhere else, just note it, relax it. Sometimes it can be useful to actually put an extra tension on the tense muscle and then relax fully. And you'll want to make the breathing regular, steady, a little bit slower than normal perhaps. Noting the breath as we breathe in and breathe out. Feeling the beautiful atmosphere of the room in which we're gathered, in the city in which we're gathered. And we're going to work with imagination to connect with the spirit of AE's mystical school and the work that they were doing with Ella Young and others to connect with the ancient mysteries of the Druids and the people before the Druids, people of the great megalithic sites. So let's imagine to ourselves that we're sitting in this room, but it's a transformed room. It's got beautiful, magical murals painted by AE with mythological scenes on them. We are, in fact, in the Dublin Hermetic Society. And on one of the four walls, we see Breed of the Tuatha Dé Danann. On another, we see Lu, the great sun fire god. On another, the Dagda with his cauldron. And on another, we see Danu. We also see on the walls representations of the four jewels of the Tuatha Dé Danann. So, as well as Lu with his spear, we see the sword of Phineas, cauldron of Murias, and the stone or jewel of Phalias. We feel that we're in a room of myth and magic where the symbols bring our inner senses to life. And we've just had a fascinating talk in the Hermetic Society about this ancient symbolism. And now we're going to go for a walk. We're going to go psychic questing. And we're excited, looking forward to this opportunity to connect with the sacred hills. And AE himself appears in our midst in his youth, with his vivid blue eyes, his slender youthful frame, reddish beard, stooping slightly forward, full of energy, full of his own inner vision. So he leads us out of the temple room, out into the streets of Dublin, and we form a group. And we begin walking towards the Dublin mountains, the wonderful mountains of South Dublin. And as we walk gently, it's a pleasant day, not too hot, we find we're going back in time. As we're half the way to the base of the mountains, we're already back in AE's time. And we can take a moment in our inner visual space to look around and see who's with us and look at our clothes. You may notice that you're dressed in the garb of AE's time. There's AE at the front and Ella Young. There's Maud Gonne, other theosophists and meditators, and we're joining them. We're now at the base of the Dublin Mountains, and we're going up the hills to a special place that is like Kilmashogue, but is in fact Kilnashee, the sacred place of the fairies. As we ascend up the slopes, we sense the changing sky, the cloud formations scuttering over. We begin to get a sense that there are other things in the air. They seem to be craft of some kind, as if there are spirits traveling in airships. A leads us onwards until suddenly we find we're at the place of our destination. We're at Kilnashee, and it is a sacred mound with a portal entrance in the traditional fashion of the ancestors, the old ancestors who were old even in the time of the Druids. We take a moment there and we suddenly realize that we're part of a grid or connected web of all the sacred sites of Ireland, of Newgrange at Brunaboyne, of Carrowkeel, Carramore, Stone Circle of Lochgur, great stone circles up in Antrim. One land blessed by the ancient earthworks of the people before the people of the Druids. A looks to us with a meaningful expression in his eyes and asks if we're ready. Are we willing to enter into the hollow hills? Are we ready to meet the beings inside, if we're allowed? We look at the portal and we see that on it there is solid stone, it seems, and there is a design. There is a triskelion, 3 spirals in the middle. And we pick out other signs, the 7 stars of the Great Bear, a ship, little representations of the 4 treasures. And as we gaze, we sense fluid, vibrant colours, as if the door is coming alive. A touches his hand forward to the middle of the triskelion, and he mutters something we can't hear under his breath, but we sense that it's in an old language. Old, even when Irish was old. And at that moment, the door becomes diaphanous and transparent, and it opens, showing us darkness inside, a warm, inviting darkness. After a moment, A.E. and Ella Young look at each other and then go inside. And then the other members of the Hermetic Society go inside. And if you wish, and if you're ready, and if you feel permitted, we too can go inside. Are you ready to enter the Hollow Hills? After a moment, most have gone in. Maybe a couple have decided they don't want to at this moment, and that's fine, they can enter another time. But those who are inside find themselves in what feels like a vast, cavernous, hollow hill space. And at first there's nothing to be seen, but we have the sense of wonderful artwork on the inside walls of the sacred mound, full of symbolism, symbolism of the sun, serpents, lightning forms spirals, full of teaching of the old world that was old before the old. And we listen, and suddenly as we listen, we see a bright light, and in that light is a great, tall being of the Aushi, a great guardian guide being. If we look at this being, it's really too bright to fully take in, but we sense his jewel-like eyes and his great power. He communicates with AE, and AE explains to us that we have been given permission to have our own adventure within the Hollow Hills, and that if we wish, our own guide will come and meet us and take us to experience whatever may be experienced in this sacred place in Kilnashi on the other side of the veil. If we are ready for this adventure, we note this with a nod of the head, and there appears from the darkness, for each of us who are undergoing this vision quest, another being, not as tall, not as grand as the great leader, as the great warrior spirit, but a guide comes to us. Now, with creative imagination, with interest, kindle your power of seeing and see how this guide appears to you. We are each told by the guide that what happens next is ours and is ours alone. So we will now take a couple of minutes, which could be a couple of ages in inner time, to experience what may experience itself for us. And now, wherever we are in our journey, our guide tells us that it's time to return. And the guide says, remember where you are, where you came to on this journey. And the guide gives us a little token, which is like a symbol or representation of what we are meant to take back from this journey as our knowledge to inspire us in the next phase of our work in the Irish mysteries. And the guide, with his hand of light, passes this to us, and we look down on it and note it carefully at this moment. It's time to return back to the mouth of the cave. And the guide brings us swiftly back. We find we are coming nearer back, not to ordinary consciousness, but to communal awareness as we walk back, the light getting slightly brighter, till we find ourselves at the mouth of the cave, whither all the friends who have been on their own individual vision quests. We feel that we've been through something, and we're going to take the mood of it back to our ordinary lives. But our token is for us and for us alone. Now, at this moment, the guides disappear back to their own realms, and the great one of the hosts of the She gives us a final dismissal and a blessing with what seems to be the smile of the fairy. It disappears. We feel a light behind us, and we turn around and we see again the portal opening. We sense the Triskelion. AE again touches it. The screen becomes diaphanous. We all pass back through it, back into the light of day. It's now late afternoon on a Dublin day, clouds moving fast overhead. We turn back and see that the doorway is allowing the last of our group to come back through, and then when we're all back, it becomes stone and symbol again. It's time to return, and we return a little bit more swiftly, back down from Kilnashi, back down the slopes of the mountains, hearing and feeling the sense that there are beings moving in the air, but feeling the call of the ordinary life. We descend the slopes again, and as we do, we feel we're moving forward again in history. When we come to the foothills again, to the ground, we start to see architecture of more modern times, 18th century. We walk slowly back through the peaceful Dublin as it is, forward in time until we find ourselves outside the front door of this building of the United Arts Club. We see that AE is no longer with us. And as we walk up the stairs, we see we're wearing our ordinary clothes. Up the stairs, and we come into this room. And as we look around, we see it's no longer the magical lodge with the paintings of the god, the Tuatha Dé Danann, and the jewels. It is, in fact, a Georgian Dublin townhouse, but with a wonderful painting of AE on the back wall, with his eyes gleaming with what looks like a mischievous twinkle. Our symbol is now no longer physically present, but it's in our imagination, and we keep that with us as a memento of our journey into the sacred realms, into the hollow hills. And so our journey is complete, and we must come back into our bodies. So we begin by feeling our feet, legs, our torso, shoulders, arms, our heads. We breathe in. Become aware of the normal sounds of a room in 2025. And when we're ready, we open our eyes. So, are we all back in the physical world? These kind of guided visualizations, there's an art to getting the most out of them, where we enter into them with a suspension of disbelief, but we also know that they are largely, they are creative imagination, but they are not just imagination. So we don't drown in them, but we also enjoy them to the maximum. So I would, that if everyone received some kind of symbol in the guided visualization, I would say, do retain that and think about it in the days to come. And that will be the yield, as it were. That will be the proof of the pudding, if you like. So, right, thank you very much. That was an attempt to give a brief flavour of the kind of thing AE was doing. And I'd like to just finish this talk by reading a passage which I discovered this morning and had forgotten, but which is very pertinent, from Flowering Dusk by Ellie Young. Presently AE came in. He had in his hands a drawing of an airship, a drawing in coloured chalk. He had seen the airship at Kilmashog. We fell to talking of airships and of the sacred mountain of Kilmashog. The folk of Dana have these ships, said AE. I think they go about in them often, and we spy on them now and then. Violet had seen airships. They were like this one that AE had drawn. You could see them at Newgrange too, said Violet. Over the mound of Angus, a group of us saw 3 in broad daylight. They must have seen them in ancient Ireland too, said I, for in the annals it is recorded, this year a wonder, 3 ships in the air over Tara. How far back all these wonders reached in Ireland. One heard fairy music on the sacred mountain. Did not Finn, thousands of years ago, on a night of the nights, encounter a god from the sacred mountain of Slieve who brought music with him and devastated Tara? At Kilmashog, an old and gracious master, like a king out of the golden age, showed himself at times and instructed disciples. Kilmashog could open. In a fire body one could enter it to find a vast chamber and learn wisdom from the master. AE had been in there many times. Violet had been there. A French poet that I knew had entered and had found an altar. And the master had said, "This is the altar on which souls are fashioned." Thank you.